There's an article that was published in The Atlantic yesterday by Jeffrey Goldberg that has garnered a lot of attention, not because it tells us anything about Donald Trump that we don't already know, but because it validates and reiterates and reminds us of a lot of things we do know about him that should have been deal breakers way back when we first found out about them, but for some reason weren't. And haven't been, and for a lot of people, still aren't. Here are a few of the high/lowlights. Trump privately complained about paying the funeral costs for Vanessa Guillen, a U.S. Army private who was murdered by a fellow soldier at Fort Hood in April 2020. After promising Guillen's family and their attorney that he would help them pay for the funeral, and claiming to a reporter that he had personally paid funeral costs for other families, Trump became angry when he learned how much the bill for the funeral actually was. Quoting now from Jeffrey Goldberg's article, Trump asked, "Did they bill us for the funeral? What did it cost?" According to attendees and to contemporaneous notes of the meeting taken by a participant, an aide answered, "Yes, we received the bill. The funeral cost $60,000. Trump became angry. "It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican." He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order, "Don't pay it." Later that day, he was still agitated. "Can you believe it?" he said, according to a witness. "Fucking people trying to rip me off." The family attorney told me she sent the bill to the White House, but no money was ever received by the family from Trump. Some of the costs were covered by the Army, which offered, she said, to allow Guillen to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and some were covered by donations. Ultimately, Guillen was buried in Houston. Vanessa Guillen's parents are Mexican immigrants, hence the "it doesn't take $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican" remark. During the George Floyd protests in 2020, Trump suggested to the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they deploy active duty military troops to forcibly disperse the protesters. Quoting Goldberg again, Secretary of Defense Esper told National Public Radio in 2022, "We reached that point in the conversation where he looked frankly at Joint Chiefs Chairman General Milley and said, 'Can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something?' When defense officials argued against Trump's desire, the president screamed, according to witnesses, 'You're all fucking losers.' Also, here's a fun fact, Trump apparently believes that soldiers who are captured or go missing in action should just be abandoned because they're bad at their jobs. Quote, Trump, those who have worked for him say, is unable to understand the military norm that one does not leave fellow soldiers behind on the battlefield. As president, Trump told senior advisors that he didn't understand why the U.S. government placed such value on finding soldiers missing in action. To him, they could be left behind because they had performed poorly by getting captured. And then there are the sections of the article that have generated the most discussion, the bits that document how much Trump loves Hitler. A few relevant passages. First, former generals who have worked for Trump say that the sole military virtue he prizes is obedience. As his presidency drew to a close, and in the years since, he has become more and more interested in the advantages of dictatorship and the absolute control over the military that he believes it would deliver. I need the kind of generals that Hitler had, Trump said in a private conversation in the White House, according to two people who heard him say this. People who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. This next bit might be my favorite. In their book, The Divider, Trump in the White House, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser reported that Trump asked John Kelly, his chief of staff at the time, "Why can't you be like the German generals?" Trump, at various points, had grown frustrated with military officials he deemed disloyal and disobedient. Throughout the course of his presidency, Trump referred to flag officers as "my generals." According to Baker and Glasser, Kelly explained to Trump that German generals tried to kill Hitler 3 times and almost pulled it off. This correction did not move Trump to reconsider his view. No, they were totally loyal to him, the president responded. This week, I asked Kelly about their exchange. He told me that when Trump raised the subject of German generals, Kelly responded by asking, "Do you mean Bismarck's generals?" He went on, "I mean, I knew he didn't know who Bismarck was or about the Franco-Prussian War." I said, "Do you mean the Kaiser's generals? Surely you can't mean Hitler's generals." And he said, yeah, Hitler's generals. I explained to him that Rommel had to commit suicide after taking part in a plot against Hitler. Kelly told me Trump was not acquainted with Rommel. Which, by the way, I believe 100%. Donald Trump is exactly the kind of asshole who will talk about how much he loves Hitler's generals and praise Hitler and the Third Reich up and down while also pretending not to be a racist and an anti-Semite and a wannabe dictator. But it's all empty rhetoric. He has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't even recognize the name of arguably the most famous Nazi general that there was in the entire war, Erwin Rommel. But anyway, Trump's former chief of staff there, who's quoted extensively in that passage, John Kelly, has been the source of some of Trump's most embarrassing and infuriating and alarming statements that he reportedly said as president, particularly when the subject is the military. Kelly, a retired Marine general who, as a young man, had volunteered to serve in Vietnam despite actually suffering from bone spurs, said in an interview for the CNN reporter Jim Sciutto's book, The Return of Great Powers, that Trump praised aspects of Hitler's leadership. He said, "Well, but Hitler did some good things," Kelly recalled. I said, "Well, what?" And he said, "Well, Hitler rebuilt the economy, but what did he do with that rebuilt economy? He turned it against his own people and against the world." Kelly admonished Trump. I said, "Sir, you can never say anything good about the guy. Nothing." This wasn't the only time Kelly felt compelled to instruct Trump on military history. In 2018, Trump asked Kelly to explain who the good guys were in World War I. Kelly responded by explaining a simple rule. Presidents should, as a matter of politics and policy, remember that the good guys in any given conflict are the countries allied with the United States. All right, actually, that last bit may be my favorite. Trump always brags about how smart he is, how he knows more about the military than the generals, he knows more about history than anybody else, and he always brags on how fantastic and world-class his education was, and all of his teachers and professors loved him, and he was the smartest boy in his class, and all. He's always talking about himself and his education that way, and in his 70s, he has to ask his chief of staff, who were the good guys in World War I? Which, granted, is a question with a very complicated answer. World War I is fucked up from every which way, but come on. You're the president of the United States. It's 2018. You're in your 70s. And you have to say to your chief of staff, hey, World War I, who were the good guys? As I mentioned at the top of the video, the anecdotes recorded in the Atlantic article are not, for the most part, things we haven't heard before. I mean, broadly speaking, it's not telling us anything we don't already know. Some of the specifics are things that haven't been reported before, but most of it is stuff that we already know, either from Jeffrey Goldberg's previous reporting or from other people who have written articles or written books or who worked for Trump and have since talked about things they heard him say or saw him do. But all of those anecdotes put together paint a very clear picture of who Donald Trump is and specifically of how he perceives the military. From his refusal to pay for Vanessa Guillen's funeral, which he offered to pay for out of his own pocket, let's not forget, to his desire to turn the military against American citizens who were exercising their right to protest, and getting angry with the members of his cabinet who were telling him, you can't do that, to his fascination with what he assumed was the unflagging loyalty of Hitler's generals, to the point where he just rejected any information to the contrary when John Kelly tried to tell him. Actually, some of Hitler's generals were very much not loyal to him and tried to kill him, and Trump just completely brushes that off and says, no, that's not true. They loved him. Everybody, all of his generals loved Hitler. Like, he will not accept information contrary to what he has already decided is true. All of that combines to show us that it's obvious that Donald Trump views the military, when he is president, as his own personal property. And he views everything as his own personal property, but it's especially perilous to think of a commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces viewing that military as not belonging to the country, but belonging to him personally. And once you know that, once you have that insight in place, everything else that he says about the military makes perfect sense. Why does he balk at paying for the funeral of a murdered soldier? Even if it comes from government funds instead of his own pocket? Why does he care about that? Why does he get mad at that? Because he views that as his money. He doesn't view that as public funds, as government money. He views that as his money. These people are trying to rip me off, he said. They're not trying, he didn't say they're trying to rip the government off. That would have been horrible as well. But he makes it personal. They're trying to rip me off. Why does he roll his eyes at the ethos of no one left behind that the military tries to honor? Because to him, captured or missing soldiers are no different than incompetent employees. And they have failed him by getting captured or by going missing. And because they have failed him, they don't deserve help. Why should we stick our necks out to find them? Why should we spend money and resources to try and get back prisoners of war or find people who have been missing in action? They're losers. They failed. They failed me as the president, as Donald Trump. To hell with them. That's how he views it. Why has he privately, so far, but repeatedly, expressed a longing for military leaders like the ones he imagines served Adolf Hitler? His personal view of Hitler's generals, not necessarily a historically accurate Hitler's generals, but his own imaginary version. Why does he long for military leaders like that? Because if he's the president, he believes that everyone else in the government works for him personally. Not for the Constitution, not for the country, for him personally. And he wants people who will do what he tells them to do. And look, no matter what problems you may have with the American military as an institution, or with how big a share of our resources we devote to that military, or with how and to what purposes the American military has been projected out into the world. And believe me, I have more than my share of those kinds of problems with the American military. But no matter what you think about that, the fact remains that most people who join the military, and remember, we have an all-volunteer service in the United States and have had for decades. People who join the military join because they choose to. And most of the people who do that do so at least in part because they have a sincere love of their country and a desire to defend it and to serve its best interests. Yes, there are often economic pressures as well. Again, we're getting into areas that we could criticize the military for and should criticize it for. The fact that recruitment tends to concentrate in areas of low income, where people often join the military because they feel like it's their only way out or their best option for a career. But even in those situations, I feel like most people who join the military do so because there is at least some component of patriotism, of a sense of wanting to serve something greater than themselves. Whether that actually happens or not is a separate issue, but the intention is there, the desire is there, that selfless desire to dedicate themselves to something greater, to live with a loyalty to other people, and a loyalty to the Constitution, and a loyalty to the rule of law, and to the ideals that we at least say the country stands for, even though very, very often it does not live out those ideals, and we as a people do not live out those ideals, but at least we tell ourselves, this is what we stand for, this is what America is all about. And people who join the military dedicate themselves to the service of those ideals. And that kind of selflessness, that kind of dedication to a higher cause, to a greater purpose, that is incomprehensible to Donald Trump. The people who serve in the military, officers and enlisted personnel alike, yes, they do serve under the authority of the president. They do obey the orders of the president, but they don't do that because they work for the president. They aren't employees. They serve the country. They serve the Constitution. And they serve the president because, in theory, the president also serves the country and serves the Constitution and is serving a role that is limited and defined by that Constitution and by the rule of law. That principle doesn't apply with Donald Trump. He has no interest in serving anyone or anything other than himself and his own interests. He doesn't know how to serve anything else than himself and his own narrow, selfish interests. So if you currently wear a uniform of the United States Armed Services, or you are a veteran who has worn that uniform, or someone you know and care about wears the uniform or has done, let me ask you this. Actually, no, ask yourself this. Ask yourself this question. Is Donald Trump the kind of person you want to be in charge of the military in this country? Again? I mean, we've seen what he did or what he wanted to do with it when he was president before. He wanted to turn active duty military on peaceful protesters who were American citizens, who were acting out their constitutionally guaranteed right to protest. He wanted to send troops into the streets to shoot them in the legs because I guess he thought seeing people protesting in the street made him look bad. And he wanted to get rid of it. Shoot him in the legs. Is that the guy that you want to be in charge of the military? The guy who said it doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican? And he said this about a young woman who wore the uniform of the United States Army and who was murdered at an Army base, whose family Trump had previously promised to help pay for the funeral? And then when the bill comes due, he says it shouldn't cost that much to bury a fucking Mexican? A fucking Mexican. That's what he calls a veteran of the United States who died, who was killed on an American Army base. Is that the guy that you think should be in charge of the military? The guy who admires Hitler and also admires many present-day dictators like Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban or Kim Jong-un? The guy who aspires to govern like them? The guy who wishes he, as president, had the kind of autocratic power that they have? Is that the guy that you think should be in charge of the military again? The guy who has called dead and wounded American soldiers suckers and losers. There's one of his greatest hits that I haven't mentioned in this video yet. The guy who demands absolute loyalty to himself, but otherwise seems utterly baffled by the concept of loyalty. Is that the guy you think should be in charge of the United States military? When people enlist in the United States Army, they take an oath of enlistment. I've never served in the Army or any other branch of the military, so I've never taken this oath. But that oath begins with these words: I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If you love, or at least respect, America's military and the people who serve in it, and you honor the spirit of that oath, whether or not you've ever actually taken it, you cannot vote for Donald Trump. In word and deed, he is the antithesis of that oath and of everything it represents. He doesn't act to support or defend the Constitution or the United States as a nation. He acts to support and defend and protect himself. And there is nothing and no one that he will not put in front of himself if he thinks that that will allow him to escape consequences or escape punishment. He will throw anyone and anything under the bus to protect himself. He will betray anything if he thinks that it will result in a better outcome for him. That's who he is. That's who he has shown himself to be over and over and over again for his entire life. He profanes what we are supposed to stand for. And even more importantly than that, he represents a genuine, legitimate threat, he and his supporters, to democracy itself, to the rule of law in this country itself. If you're eligible, and if any of this means anything to you, please vote in this election if you haven't already, and please vote for Kamala Harris, because Donald Trump can't be trusted in charge of the fry station at McDonald's, and he sure as hell can't be trusted with the United States military.